Audie Murphy was the real deal, one who could talk the talk and walk the walk. His way from North Africa to France in World War II, becoming the most decorated soldier in US history.
He was 112 pounds of skin and bone, a 5 foot 5 inches Texas farm boy who looked like he belonged in a classroom, not a foxhole. Every military branch laughed him out of the recruitment office for being too small, except the Army, and even they didn't expect him to survive a week. But Audie Murphy didn't just survive. He became a one-man wrecking crew. Most people think his combat stories are Hollywood fairy tales, but the truth is actually much crazier. The one-shot survivalist, the Texas sharpshooter. To understand how a kid who looked like a stiff breeze could blow him over became a whirlwind of destruction on the battlefield, you have to look at the red dirt of Hunt County, Texas. Audie Murphy wasn't born into a life of privilege. He was born into a desperate, grinding poverty that most of us can't even wrap our heads around today. He was one of 12 children born to poor sharecroppers. And poor is doing a lot of heavy lifting here. We are talking about a family that lived in a converted shack where the wind whistled through the walls and dinner was never a guarantee. This wasn't the kind of poverty you see in movies with a soft lens. It was the kind of hunger that hollows out your stomach and defines your every waking thought. When Audie was still just a boy, his father pulled a vanishing act, walking out on the family and leaving them to fend for themselves. This left a massive weight on young Audie's shoulders. He dropped out of school in the 5th grade to pick cotton for a few cents a day. But his real contribution to the family's survival happened in the woods. Because the Murphys couldn't afford to buy meat at a store, Audie became the primary provider at an age when most kids today are worrying about their middle school social life. He didn't have the luxury of being a hobbyist hunter. For him, the woods were a grocery store, and the price of entry was a single bullet. He would head into the brush with a beat-up old .22 caliber rifle, and here's the kicker. He literally could not afford to miss. Ammunition cost money they didn't have. If Audie fired a shot and missed a squirrel or a rabbit, that was a bullet and a meal wasted. This wasn't just about marksmanship, it was about survival math. He learned to track, to stay silent, and to wait for the perfect moment with a level of discipline that grown men struggled to master. He developed a one-shot, one-kill mentality out of sheer necessity. It wasn't about sport, it was about preventing his siblings from going to bed with empty stomachs. By the time he was a teenager, he was arguably one of the best marksmen in the state of Texas, possessing a level of patience and hand-eye coordination that would eventually become a nightmare for the German army. When soldiers later saw him pick off targets from impossible distances under fire, they thought he was a natural-born prodigy. The truth was much grittier. He had spent his childhood staring down the barrel of a rifle, knowing that if his hand shook, his family didn't eat. That kind of pressure creates a steel-trap mind. By age 12, Audie was already a veteran of the struggle for life. But if the Army thought his small frame was a liability, they were about to get a 112-pound wake-up call. The triple rejection. Go home and grow up. If you saw Audie Murphy standing in line at a recruitment office in 1942, you probably would have pointed him toward the nearest Boy Scout troop. After the attack on Pearl Harbor, Audie was desperate to serve, but he had two major problems. He was underweight, and he was technically too young. He was a 5'5", 112-pound teenager who looked like he hadn't started shaving yet. To the United States military, which was looking for brawny heroes to take on the Axis powers, Audie looked more like a mascot than a machine gunner. He was the literal embodiment of the underdog. But at the time, the recruiters weren't looking for a movie plot. They were looking for soldiers who could carry a 70-pound pack without collapsing. His first stop was the United States Marine Corps. The Marines are known for taking the proud and the brave, but when they saw Audie, they mostly just felt pity. They took one look at his slight frame and baby face and turned him down flat. They didn't think he had the physical stamina to survive basic training, let alone the Pacific Theater. Not one to give up easily, Audie then tried the Navy. The Navy recruiters were equally unimpressed, essentially telling him that he was too small to be of any use on a ship. Even the paratroopers, who were usually a bit more experimental with their recruits, laughed him out of the room. It was a humiliating string of rejections for a kid who had been the primary provider for his family since he was 12 years old. But Audie Murphy had a level of stubbornness that bordered on a superpower. If he couldn't get in honestly, he'd find another way. With the help of his sister, he managed to forge his birth certificate to make himself appear a year older than he actually was. Armed with his fake ID and a lot of grit, he marched into an army recruitment office. This time, he didn't get laughed at, but he didn't exactly get a standing ovation either. The army accepted him, but only because they were getting desperate for warm bodies to fill the infantry. Even then, his instructors in basic training were convinced he was a liability. They actually tried to transfer him to be a cook or a baker, just so he wouldn't get killed on the front lines. Audie refused. He hadn't lied and scraped his way into the service just to flip flapjacks in a mess hall. He fainted during a drill once because of his slight build, which only reinforced his commander's belief that he wasn't army material. They saw a frail kid who was destined to be a statistic.
Audie Murphy is pretty much the exact same thing in real life, except there was no super serum. He was originally rejected by the Marine Corps and the paratroopers because he was only 5'4", 110 pounds.
Audie saw a man who had already survived things more terrifying than a drill sergeant. He pushed through the exhaustion, the mockery, and the physical limitations of his own body until he finally earned his way overseas. Little did those recruiters know, the kid they tried to reject 3 times was about to become the most decorated soldier the world had ever seen. He finally got his chance to fight, but nature decided to give him a deadlier enemy than the Nazis. The malaria warrior, fighting fever and fascists. By the time Audie Murphy finally made it to the Mediterranean theater, he wasn't just fighting the German army. He was fighting his own biology. Shortly after landing in Sicily, he contracted malaria, a disease that can floor a heavyweight champion, let alone a guy who barely tipped the scales at 100 and change. For most soldiers, a bout of malaria was a one-way ticket to a rear area hospital bed and a long recovery. But Audie wasn't most soldiers. He developed a pattern that would become legendary among his brothers in arms. He would shake with bone-rattling chills, run a fever high enough to cause hallucinations, and then, the moment he could stand, he would grab his carbine and head back to the front. This wasn't just toughing it out. This was a level of psychological grit that bordered on the insane. During the Allied invasion of Italy, Audie was frequently seen shivering in the mud, his face pale and sunken from the recurring fever. Yet, when the order came to move, he was consistently the first man on his feet. His commanders tried to send him back for medical leave, but Audie had a strange, almost haunting sense of responsibility to the men around him. He felt that every minute he spent in a hospital bed was a minute his friends were dying without him. He treated the war like he treated hunting back in Texas. It was a job that had to be done. And you didn't clock out just because you felt under the weather. The stories from this period are the ones that sound like tall tales until you read the official reports. On one scouting mission in Sicily, while his body was essentially eating itself from the inside out, Audie managed to ambush a group of German officers. He didn't just engage them, he outmaneuvered them with the stealth he'd perfected while hunting rabbits as a kid. He moved through the brush like a ghost, ignoring the pounding headache and the sweat dripping into his eyes. He took out several enemy soldiers and gathered vital intelligence, all while his temperature was spiking to a dangerous 104 degrees. When he returned to his lines, he collapsed, only to wake up a few hours later and ask when the next patrol was leaving. It was during these grueling months in Italy that the babyface nickname started to lose its irony. His fellow soldiers realized that the kid who looked like a schoolboy had the soul of a cold-blooded tactician. He was promoted to sergeant not because of his physical stature, but because he was simply better at staying alive and keeping others alive than anyone else in the unit. He had a sixth sense for danger, likely honed by years of poverty and survival, and he used it to lead men through some of the bloodiest terrain of the war. Malaria should have taken him out of the fight, but instead, it just proved that Audie Murphy was more dangerous on his worst day than most men were on their best. But the fevers of Italy were just a warm-up for a stand in the snow that would define military history. The Colmar Pocket, standing atop a burning bomb. If you saw this scene in a generic action movie, you'd roll your eyes and complain that the writers were being unrealistic. But for the men of the 3rd Infantry Division on January 26, 1945, it wasn't a movie, it was a nightmare. The setting was the Colmar Pocket in France, a frozen hellscape where the temperature was plummeting and the snow was knee-deep. Audie Murphy, now a 2nd lieutenant, was commanding a company that had been decimated by weeks of brutal fighting. They were down to just 19 effective men out of a full company. Suddenly, out of the fog, the worst-case scenario emerged. 6 German Tiger tanks and over 250 elite infantrymen were advancing on their position. Murphy knew his men stood zero chance in a direct confrontation. He ordered his soldiers to retreat into the woods for cover, but he didn't follow them. Instead, he stayed behind at his command post with a field telephone, calling in coordinates for artillery strikes. As the German tanks lumbered closer, a nearby M10 tank destroyer was hit and began to brew up. Military speak for, "It's about to explode." The crew scrambled out, leaving the vehicle engulfed in flames and smoke. Most sane people would have run as far as possible from a burning tank filled with gasoline and live ammunition. Audie Murphy, however, saw an opportunity. In one of the most insane displays of main character energy in recorded history, Murphy ran toward the burning tank destroyer. He climbed onto the hull, which was vibrating with the heat of the fire, and grabbed the mounted .50 caliber machine gun. To the Germans, it must have looked like a suicide mission. Here was a single, skinny kid standing on top of a pyre, silhouetted against the white snow by the orange flames licking at his boots. He started firing, and he didn't stop. For the next hour, Murphy became a human shield for his retreating men, single-handedly holding back a force that should have steamrolled his entire battalion. The Germans were baffled. They poured small arms fire, mortar shells, and even tank rounds at the burning M10. But the smoke and the sheer audacity of the act seemed to create a literal shield around him. Murphy was on the field telephone the entire time, directing artillery fire onto his own position to wipe out the infantry encroaching on his flank. When the voice on the other end of the radio asked how close the Germans were to him, Murphy reportedly yelled back, "Just hold the phone, and I'll let you talk to one of the bastards." He was exposed, bleeding from a leg wound, and standing on a literal ticking time bomb. Yet, he was as calm as he had been in the Texas woods. He killed or wounded dozens of German soldiers that day. The tanks, stripped of their infantry support and baffled by the accurate artillery raining down, eventually faltered and began to withdraw. Only when he ran out of ammunition did Murphy climb down from the burning wreck. He didn't celebrate, he didn't strike a pose. He simply turned around and walked back to his men. Legend has it that as he walked away, the tank destroyer finally exploded behind him, just like a scene from a high-budget blockbuster. He then immediately organized his exhausted, ragtag group of survivors into a counterattack and drove the remaining Germans out of the area. This wasn't just bravery, it was a total disregard for the laws of probability. When he was later awarded the Medal of Honor for this action, the citation read like a myth. Witnesses struggled to explain how he survived. The baby-faced kid had faced down 6 tanks and 250,000 men and won. The Germans who survived that day likely went home telling stories of a ghost on a burning tank that wouldn't die. It was a moment that transformed Audie Murphy from a highly decorated soldier into a living legend, the kind of story that no one believed until they saw the official military reports signed by dozens of stunned witnesses. He had survived the impossible, but the hardest part was yet to come. Convincing the world it actually happened. The Hollywood censor. Reality was too fake. After the war, Audie Murphy didn't just return to civilian life. He became one of the biggest movie stars in the world. But his path to Hollywood wasn't paved with a desire for fame. He was actually discovered by James Cagney, who saw his face on the cover of Life magazine and thought the war hero had the it factor. Eventually, the time came for Hollywood to tell the Audie Murphy story. And who better to play Audie Murphy than Audie Murphy himself? In 1955, Universal released To Hell and Back, an autobiographical film based on his memoirs. But what happened behind the scenes was almost as fascinating as the war itself. You'd think a war hero-turned-actor would want to look as heroic as possible on the big screen, right? Most actors would be begging for more explosions, more dramatic speeches, and more hero shots. Murphy was the exact opposite. He was his own toughest critic, and, more importantly, his own most aggressive censor. Throughout the filming, he constantly clashed with the director and producers because he felt the script made him look too much like a superhero. He was obsessed with making sure the film didn't look like a piece of cheap propaganda. The unbelievable part is that several of his actual documented battlefield feats were completely removed from the movie at his own insistence. For example, in real life, Murphy had captured a German machine gun nest solo by outmaneuvering them in a way that looked like something out of a ninja movie. He also had instances where he took out dozens of enemy combatants in a single afternoon. When he saw these scenes in the script, he shook his head and told the director, "No one is going to believe this." He was convinced that if the film showed the literal unvarnished truth of what he had done, the audience would laugh him out of the theater for being unrealistic. Think about that for a second. The man had to tone down his life story because reality was too fake for cinema. He even had to fight to make the Colmar Pocket scene look less miraculous. In the film, it's still an incredible sequence, but the sheer duration and the proximity of the German tanks were slightly adjusted to fit within the audience's suspension of disbelief. Murphy was worried that he would be seen as a braggart or a fake if the movie showed the full extent of his Medal of Honor citation. He wanted the film to be a tribute to the men he lost, not a monument to his own ego. This created a strange paradox. The movie To Hell and Back became a massive hit. It was Universal's highest-grossing film for 20 years until Jaws came along, but it was still a watered-down version of the truth. Fans went to the theater and saw an incredible war story, never realizing that the man on the screen had actually been even more capable and more dangerous than the character he was playing. Murphy's humility was so deep-seated that he preferred to be seen as Hollywood brave, rather than have the public doubt the weight of his real-world medals. His performance in the film was praised for its quiet, understated intensity. People thought he was just a natural actor, but the truth was that he wasn't acting the trauma or the focus. He was simply revisiting it. By censoring his own heroics, he managed to keep the focus on the grit and the brotherhood of the infantry. But in doing so, he left the most insane parts of his legend in the official military archives, away from the public eye. But while he was hiding his heroics on screen, he couldn't hide the shadows that followed him home. The weight of the medals, PTSD, and public advocacy. By the time Audie Murphy hung up his uniform, he was a walking monument of brass and ribbon. He had earned every single medal for valor that the United States had to offer, plus several high honors from France and Belgium.
In the process, earning himself the Medal of Honor, the Distinguished Service Cross, 2 Silver Stars that he earned in the span of 3 days, 2 Bronze Stars with V device, 2 French Croix de Guerre, and the French Legion of Honor. He was the inspiration for one of the greatest Americans of all time.
To the public, he was the ultimate winner, the boy who conquered the world. But behind the scenes, the war hadn't ended for him. Murphy was one of the first high-profile examples of what we now call post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD. But back in the late 40s and 50s, it was still referred to by the dismissive clinical name of battle fatigue. The unbelievable part of this story isn't a battlefield feat. It's the quiet, terrifying reality of his daily life. Despite being a major movie star and a national icon, Murphy lived in a state of constant, high-alert survival. He suffered from debilitating nightmares that would leave him waking up in a cold sweat, screaming. His first wife, Wanda Hendricks, would later recount how the national hero slept with a loaded .45 caliber pistol under his pillow. He would often wake up and point it at shadows in the room, still convinced he was in a foxhole in the Vosges Mountains. He was a man who had survived the fire, but he was still being burned by the smoke. What makes Murphy a true pioneer, however, is what he did with that pain. In an era where men were expected to be silent and strong, and where mental health struggles were seen as a sign of weakness or shattered nerves, Murphy did the unthinkable. He talked about it. He didn't just mention it in passing. He used his massive platform to speak out about the psychological toll of combat. He was brutally honest about his addiction to Placidil, a powerful sleeping pill he used to cope with his insomnia and anxiety. When he realized he was hooked, he didn't check into a luxury rehab. He locked himself in a motel room for a week and went through the agonizing process of cold turkey withdrawal alone. He became a vocal advocate for returning veterans, demanding that the government do more to study the unseen wounds of war. He pushed for better medical treatment and more empathy for the guys who came home looking fine on the outside, but feeling broken on the inside. By being so transparent about his own shattered state, he gave permission to thousands of other soldiers to seek help without shame. He effectively used his legendary status as a shield to protect others from the stigma of mental illness. This was perhaps his most courageous stand. Standing on a burning tank destroyer is one thing. You have adrenaline and a machine gun for that. But standing in front of a judgmental public and admitting you are struggling with your mind takes a different kind of guts. Murphy refused to let the military or the public treat veterans like disposable parts. He knew that the medals didn't make the memories go away. And by speaking his truth, he paved the way for the modern understanding of veteran care. He was still fighting for his men, long after the guns had gone silent. The war hero had become a champion for the broken, but his own journey would end in a way no one saw coming. The Great Duel, the German sniper who met his match. While the world remembers Audie Murphy for his loud, explosive stand at the Colmar Pocket, his fellow soldiers often told a much quieter, more terrifying story about the day he went head-to-head with a German sniper. In the dense woods of France, a master marksman from the German side had pinned down Murphy's unit. This wasn't just some guy with a rifle, he was a professional, a ghost who was picking off American soldiers one by one with surgical precision. Every time an GI tried to locate the source of the fire, they were met with a bullet. The unit was paralyzed, huddled in the dirt, waiting for a savior who could see through the trees. Audie Murphy decided he was that savior. But instead of charging in with guns blazing, He went back to the lessons he'd learned in the Texas brush as a hungry kid. He knew that a sniper's greatest weapon is your own curiosity. If you peek, you die. So, Murphy decided to play a game of psychological chess. He crawled forward into the no man's land between the lines, moving with the silent, belly-crawling grace of a predator. He didn't have a high-powered scope. He had an M1 carbine and a brain that was wired for survival. The unbelievable part of this story is the trick Murphy used to bait the German. It's a move that sounds like it belongs in a Saturday morning cartoon, but in the life-or-death stakes of 1944, it was genius. Murphy took his helmet, placed it on a stick, and slowly raised it just above a log. He didn't just shove it up. He mimicked the hesitant, jerky movement of a nervous soldier trying to get a look at the battlefield. The German sniper, despite all his training, fell for the bait. A single shot rang out, punching a hole clean through the helmet. In that split second, most people would have ducked. But Murphy didn't. He had been watching the tree line with the intensity of a hawk. He saw the tiny puff of muzzle smoke and the slight rustle of a branch several hundred yards away. Before the German could bolt his rifle to chamber another round, Murphy was on his feet. He didn't just fire. He sprinted toward the position, closing the gap with terrifying speed. The German sniper, realizing he'd been duped, tried to readjust, but it was too late. Murphy fired 2 shots. Both hit their mark. When he reached the sniper's nest, he found an elite German marksman who had been terrorizing the division for days. Murphy didn't celebrate. He didn't take a trophy. He simply signaled to his men that the path was clear and kept moving. It was a one-on-one duel that proved Murphy wasn't just a hero because he was brave. He was a hero because he was smarter than the enemy. He had turned a high-stakes military engagement into a simple hunting trip, and once again, the kid from Texas was the only one who walked away. A hero's end. Audie Murphy had survived the most brutal combat in human history, escaped death by malaria, and walked away from a burning tank that should have been his funeral pyre. He seemed untouchable, a man who had cheated the Reaper so many times that the world assumed he would live to be 100. But on May 28, 1971, the luck that had carried him through North Africa, Italy, and France finally ran out. Murphy was a passenger on a private plane traveling to Virginia for a business meeting. In a cruel twist of fate, the man who had navigated the fog of war couldn't survive the fog of the Blue Ridge Mountains. The plane crashed into Brush Mountain, killing everyone on board. He was only 45 years old. The news of his death sent shockwaves through the country.
Audie Murphy, the most decorated man of World War II, who went on to become a movie star, was found dead this afternoon in the wreckage of a light plane in the hills of Virginia. The plane went down on Friday afternoon near the top of a mountain.
To the public, it felt wrong. A hero of his magnitude shouldn't have died in a tragic accident. He should have faded away in a rocking chair on a Texas porch. When it came time to lay him to rest, the military offered him the full grand honors befitting a man of his stature. As the most decorated soldier in American history, he was entitled to a monument at Arlington National Cemetery that would tower over the others, perhaps even adorned with gold leaf to signify his unmatched valor. True to form, Murphy had left instructions that reflected the humble sharecropper he had always been at heart. He requested a plain, simple headstone, exactly like those given to the ordinary privates who served alongside him. He didn't want to be a general in death. He wanted to be one of the boys. Today, his grave is the second most visited site at Arlington, trailing only that of John F. Kennedy. It is a modest piece of stone that doesn't list his dozens of medals or his Hollywood credits. It just says his name. His death marked the end of an era, but the unbelievable nature of his life remains. He was a man who lived 3 lifetimes in the span of 4 decades: a hunter, a warrior, and a star. Even in his final moments, he remained the same unassuming kid from Hunt County who never quite understood what all the fuss was about. He didn't need a gold-leafed marker to prove his worth. The lives of the men he saved in the snow of France were monument enough. He left behind a legacy that was too big for a single grave, proving that the smallest man can leave the largest shadow. Click subscribe for more amazing content here in this channel. Thanks for watching till the end.